So, now we're going to talk about the beginnings of the science. In the previous few lectures, we discussed how the science evolved and became a science. But today, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Wilhelm Wundt. And you will see that it was the perfect timing for psychology. And you will see that there is a synthesis of ideas from the philosophical and the physiological. So lectures 2 and 3, they are in full display. So let's get started. So let's learn who is attributed oftentimes as the father of psychology. I will tell you that it's not a universal. There are people who disagree with this. Hold on, there's something happening outside my door. Give me 1 second. Sorry, it looked like one of my neighbors was hosing something down. All right, so Wundt is considered the founder of the field of psychology. Now, he was not considered the originator of the field. And in fact, there are many people who give credit to Fechner, right? Fechner, we talked about, wrote the first book on the discipline, and he contributed to that. So, but nevertheless, even though many people appreciate Fechner's work, we tend to consider Wundt the founder of the discipline, and I'll explain to you why on the upcoming slides. He was also the person who created the first laboratory and the first journal in experimental psychology. His research interests were on sensation and perception. So a lot of the consciousness studies that we talk about were originated by Wundt. Things like attention and association, he adopted those into his field too. Now, Wundt himself, although we give credit to Wundt as the father of the discipline or the founder of the discipline, Wundt himself acknowledged Fechner's contribution. And he said Fechner's work was the first conquest of experimental psychology. And Wundt's student, Edward Titchener, also suggested Fechner should have been credited as the father of psychology. So there are key people that we acknowledge on influencing the beginning of the discipline. So you might say, okay, well, what's the difference between being a founder and an originator? We will give Fechner credit for being the originator of the field of psychology and perhaps even the literary birth of the discipline through elements of psychophysics. And these elements were a decade and a half earlier than Wundt's formal establishment of the discipline. So if you look at Wundt's contribution to sensation perception, they do overlap to some degree as well. So you're like, are we doing a semantic argument? Why are we talking about originator versus founder? And the answer is, to be a founder of a discipline, it has to be a deliberate process. While Fechner offered incredible insights to psychology, he was not intentionally creating psychology as a discipline, right? Whereas Wundt, in his Principles of Physiological Psychology, wrote explicitly that he wanted to make psychology its own discipline. And there is a difference between founding something and contributing in meaningful ways or outstanding scientific contribution. We know that Wundt benefited from a lot of the prior knowledge. And in fact, in order to be a founder, more often than not, you have to integrate the ideas that are already out there, and you have to promote these ideas. And that's kind of that last bullet point about promoting it is probably the biggest argument for Wundt and against Fechner. So that's why we give Wundt the credit. He did all of those things. He promoted the experimental psychology. He absolutely separated psychology from philosophy. So let's learn a little bit more about who Wundt was. So Wundt grew up as an only child, didn't do well in school, and he actually didn't even like school. He struggled to make friends, and his teachers were harsh on him. But there was a lot of pressure on him because of legacy. If we were to study Wundt's lineage, many of them were eminent scholars of their day. So Wundt had pressure on him to measure up to those who came before him. Perhaps that's part of the reason why he disliked school initially, is that he didn't want to be forced to perform. Eventually, he decided he wanted to become a medical doctor, and the purpose was to work in science and make a little money along the way, make a good living. So he starts in medical school, discovers that he absolutely does not like medicine, and he switched over to the discipline of physiology, which is the same content we were talking about in lecture 3. So you'll see that the names we mentioned, Johann Mueller and Wilhelm von Helmholtz, these individuals will shape Wundt's life. So as a student of Mueller and as a lab assistant of Helmholtz, they were leaders of the craft, they were his mentors, and they were highly accomplished people in their own scientific career. So he was able to learn the discipline needed to be successful in the craft. So while he's working in this area of physiology, he comes up with the notion that he wants to make an experimental science of psychology, and he starts to write, and he writes the contributions to the theory of sensory perception. You'll notice that the books are italicized so that you know that it was a manuscript. And his original research lab was a makeshift lab. It was a home laboratory, but he was able to accomplish much in his makeshift lab before he gained prominence. Another important thing, the term experimental psychology was coined. So when you think of experimental psychology, Wundt is the person who coined that. And then he started lecturing. So he lectured on the mind of men and animals. He turned that into a book. This book was reprinted several years later, 30 years later in English. And what's interesting is Titchener, which was his student, did a lot of the translation. And there are these subtle differences in Wundt's work and Titchener's work. But if you read the translation, those subtle differences sort of disappear. So some people criticize Titchener's translation of Wundt's work as perhaps he translated in favor of his own ideas. So he talked about the problems of the day, things like reaction time and psychophysics, which were prominent. And he taught his first psychology course at the University of Heidelberg, which he referred to or as the physiological psychology. Now, physiological, we generally think of it as the body or biology, but physiological in German was experimental. So when you coin the term physiological psychology, really he was referring to experimental psychology. And it's the first course like this. He created the first course there. And when I say he created or offered the first course like this, that's important because we're going to see a little bit later that a lot of the earliest psychologists or psychology researchers had to go to Germany, had to meet with Wundt and learn from Wundt. So you'll see a lot of this traveling to Germany to learn because there's nothing else being offered like this at that time. So eventually he writes Principles of Physiological Psychology, and this becomes his masterpiece or his magnum opus, and creates a lab. And this gives him the opportunity to document the progress or the development of the discipline. Ultimately, he revised this into 6 editions. So the first publication, he added to it for the second and third and fourth, and he modified it 6 times, basically. So by 1875 to 1920, he's a professor of philosophy at Leipzig. That's considered a prestigious position. The title, we already talked about the term professor versus other terms. That term is a status symbol, so they acknowledged his accomplishments. And while at Leipzig, that's where he creates the first psychology laboratory. So if there is a question on an exam that says, what year was psychology founded? You're going to say 1879. And that laboratory becomes the model for everyone to follow. In 1881, he creates the Journal of Philosophical Studies, which was the first psychology journal. And he didn't really want to call it Philosophical Studies. The only problem is calling it Psychological Studies, he couldn't do because there was already a journal out there. So he couldn't reuse the same name. So eventually, this journal becomes defunct, and by 1906, he was able to get the name that he wanted, the Journal of Psychological Studies. So, as I mentioned, Wundt's influence was profound. He trained the first generation of experimental psychologists, and you will see that his students traveled the world. His students were able to establish laboratories in the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia Teachers College, Yale, Harvard, Cornell, Stanford, amongst others. And then in other countries of interest, Italy, Russia, and Japan, there were labs that were created from his students. So this is a famous picture of Wundt and his colleagues doing research. And this is a picture of his laboratory. Now, if you were to think about his influence, he was considered very, very popular. He had enrollments that we don't see, certainly at our college, of 600 people at one time. Now, if you have an enrollment of 600 people, that is going to reduce the amount of individualized attention a person gets. But nevertheless, having 600 people, you're also able to maximize your impact on the science. In terms of his personal life and his schedule, he was very regimented. In the morning, he would work on his books. He averaged 2.2 pages of writing a day. So he was very, very prolific. He read papers and edited his journal. And in the afternoon, he basically did his research and taught his lecture. In the evenings, he had a little bit more leisure. So he spent time enjoying music and talking about politics and advocating for student rights. So he had a very full day, very regimented day, but you could see why his scholarship was so profound, because he dedicated morning and afternoon to constantly putting out more stuff. So 1880 to 1891, he started writing on things like ethics and logic and philosophy. And as a companion to experimental psychology, he wrote Volcker Psychology. Now, Volcker Psychology literally means folk psychology, but it really wasn't folk psychology. It was more cultural psychology. So it's very important. People oftentimes say, oh, that was his, folklore. But no, it was really social psychology, human development, things like that. So it was very much psychology. It just wasn't sensation and perception stuff. He was interested in how morals and customs and laws and values influence a person, right? So each culture has its own value system. So when you think about it, he influenced both the experimental side of psychology, but he also dabbled in social psychology. And it's interesting because I teach social psychology and we rarely mention Wundt there. And it's unfortunate, but I will show you why that is shortly. So Volcker Psychology, we have the experimental, which is your sensation perception studies. And then you have your social psychology, which is learning, memory, things like language and culture, all of these things that could influence one's experience. Now, he said that you couldn't really study some of the factors of social psychology using an experimental way, but they were better understood through sociology and anthropology. And it's interesting because that proved to be false, right? We have a whole discipline of social psychology. And if I were to say, well, what's the difference between the lens of psychology and sociology? Sociology generally has a more bird's eye view, a macro view, whereas psychology tends to have more of a micro view. So his belief that you couldn't study social issues and social psychology proved to be incorrect. But why is it that we don't give as much attention to Wundt in social psychology? The answer is simple. If we were to look at his day, his contributions were largely in the experimental realm, and people were not mentioning his work in cultural psychology. So we have about 4% of his citations. That is when another person acknowledged his work. Only 4% of his citations were related to cultural psychology. And that explains, right? That explains why he had very little impact. Okay, so perhaps it was the day, perhaps it was the timing, right? So people theorize, well, why was it that America just did not have an interest in Wundt's cultural psychology? Well, one argument is that as a society, we were less open to foreign work. and people tended to rely on their own findings over Wundt's findings. And that's interesting because if we go back, I mentioned to you that the first generation of experimental psychologists were students of Wundt. They went to Germany to learn under him, and they brought the wisdom of Wundt's lab to America. So while they were willing to receive and learn from him, at a certain point, they turned away from his ideas and started acknowledging their own work. Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, philosophy and physiology both helped shape psychology. And if I were to ask you, well, what was the focus in the time of Wundt? Consciousness, right? Consciousness is your experience, your acknowledged experience. So it's not what's happening beneath the surface, but rather what's happening that you can recognize. Now, if you look at some of the ideas, he did benefit from the empiricists, right? The ideas of associationism, the ideas of reductionism. These ideas were useful. However, versus, in opposition to the empiricists, which suggests that the mind was a passive entity, Wundt did not agree. Wundt felt that we have an active process, a conscious process of trying to understand the world. So it's almost what we say with Piaget, a constructivist viewpoint, where we play a role in constructing our understanding of the world around us. That was a major point of divergence, and that actually was a good point of divergence because a lot of great research came from that. And if we're to look at his methodology, Wundt used experimental methods, which were commonplace in his day, used by physiologists and psychophysicists. Now, Wundt referred to the name of his system, and again, we talked about theories of psychology and these different subdisciplines, but Wundt named his type, his system, volunteerism. And that's considered the first true theory or system of psychology. Now, you might wonder, well, why did he name it volunteerism? It came from the word volition, or voluntary, or actively choosing. So it's an acknowledgement that we have the ability to organize mental elements or mental contents into higher level thought processes, right? So, but we actively work on those mental contents or mental elements. It doesn't happen passively, right? So now Wundt focused on consciousness as it is fully constructed versus the elements that it's comprised of. And this is a big distinction that separates Wundt from his student Titchener. So yeah, Wundt acknowledged that the mind is made up of smaller parts, but we put it all together, associate or combine it for a conscious experience. So he focused more on the process of building up consciousness rather than the parts or the basic parts that make up consciousness. Okay. So he also differentiated between the term immediate and immediate experience. The word immediate really should be mediated, right? Because it's mediated or influenced by past experience. So it's very important to understand that if it's influenced or mediated by past experiences, it could be biased. So we have to acknowledge that the immediate experience has some potential biases. So the immediate experience, Wundt felt, was a little bit better and should be the focus of psychology because it's not influenced by past experience. It's unbiased by interpretation. So what did Wundt do? He used introspection as a way of trying to understand immediate experiences, right? So ultimately, introspection is his research tool. And then, some people suggest that Wundt was trying to come up with a periodic table of the mind. You'll see that Titchener runs with this idea of a periodic table of the mind a little bit further than Wundt. So let's try and understand what a immediate experience is and an immediate experience. So if you hear someone say the rose is red, the immediate experience would be focused on the flower as a composite, right? So in order to know that that is a flower, you have to have past experience with the flower. So that would be immediate or mediated experience, versus an immediate experience would be to describe the redness of the rose. And that redness you can only react to in the present, what you're seeing. So we can differentiate between a mediated and an immediate experience. So let's take another one as an example. I have a toothache, right? So we can focus on the person who has the toothache, and the person, if we put the focus there, that would be immediate experience, versus the perception of pain, describing the qualities of pain, that would be more of an immediate experience. So you'll notice your sensory experience of whatever redness or pain, those are your immediate experiences. Those are the ones that are least likely to be biased by past experience. So what is the method of introspection? Introspection is really referred to as internal perception, right? So intro means within, examining within. Spection, like a spectacle, right? We used to refer to glasses as spectacles. So there were looking glasses, right? So if we put the words together, introspection, that means looking inward, or internal perception. So we have to have a way of tapping into our conscious experience, right? So this idea was quite useful, right? So it wasn't his original idea. We see that Socrates originates the concept of introspection. And what Wundt did was he was able to create more experimental control so that the introspection process would be more accurate. And we'll talk about some of the things he did to increase precision. Other people were not fans of introspection, so critics suggested that if you spend too much time looking inward, you might lose your mind, you might become insane. That's not true. And then in terms of introspection, its use is also derived from physics. So understanding light waves and sound and, our sensory experience, all of this physicists were studying as well. So what were Wundt's 4 rules? 1, the observers must know when the procedure begins. They must be in a state of mindfulness or readiness. So they have to be prepared and focused. whatever observation that occurs, it has to be repeatable numerous times. So for those of us who do research, this is what we call replication studies, being able to consistently get a similar outcome. And he also understood that you could vary the level of control or whatever stimulus you're manipulating. So all four of these rules must be present to get good data. So Wundt felt that introspection was great and was the tool that we could answer any issue related to psychology. And similar to a telescope that we look into the stars, introspection, we look inward, right? But remember how I said he was pretty rigid and he was very much interested in being able to reproduce his findings? Well, in order for him to trust data coming from his students, he would require a minimum of 10,000 introspections. 10,000. That is an astronomical number. But if you practice something over and over and over, you practice it 10,000 times, you're probably going to get good at it. You're probably going to get consistent at it. And, you know, well-trained lab assistants goes a long way in getting, you know, good results. So in terms of what he measured, he focused on things that could be quantified or measured specifically. Things like size or intensity, duration, things like that, you could actually quantify. He did not focus as much on the subjective experience or the qualitative experience, things like pleasantness. Pleasantness is subject to the interpretation of a person, and he did not want subjective data, so he chucked it. So if you were to look at his relationship to people like Weber and Fechner, you start to see a very similar mindset of being able to quantify whatever psychological experience there was. And sure enough, if we look at the publications between 1883 and 1903, in the 20 years that he published, 176 out of the 180 articles were quantitative in nature. So he was big on objective measures. And in terms of trying to get these objective measures, he used things like reaction time, because you have a stopwatch that you could control. So what are the goals of psychology when you think about it? Well, Wundt established three goals. He said first, he wanted to analyze our conscious process and be able to break them down into their basic elements. But he also wanted to be able to understand how these elements came together as a composite, how they were synthesized, how they were organized, so that the conscious experience is more of what's happening in bullet point 1 than what's happening in bullet point 2. I take that back. Well, Wundt focused more on bullet point 2 than 1. So your conscious experience is really the synthesis of the experience. While you need to know the elements, that isn't the focus. So, and he established laws of connection, which tried to explain how these elements are organized into a conscious experience. So what are the two basic elements? The first element is sensations, right? So what is a sensation? That is the stimulation of a sense organ, right? Which results in some kind of neurological impulse to the brain. And when we talk about sensation, he focused on intensity, duration, modality, and he felt that these images were exciting the cerebral cortex, and sensations operated similar to images. So there are sensations, and then there's feelings. Now, feelings, as you are thinking, he didn't use the word the way we use feelings today. Believe it or not, his understanding of feelings were your experience in real time, in that moment, that's happening in your immediate experience. So it wasn't based on past knowledge. It was based on what's happening now. And feelings were your subjective experience as it related to senses. So you could qualify your feelings in 3 different ways, whether it was pleasurable or pleasurable, tense or relaxed state, excitement or depression. And one of the strategies he used to tap into this tridimensional theory of feelings was a metronome. And you could have a metronome tick at different speeds. And depending on the speed, it could be a pleasant rhythm, or it could be an uncomfortable rhythm or a pleasureful rhythm. It also, depending on the sound, could induce tension or relaxation. So if you watch some of the old films where they have the drum beat, boom, 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 right? Something of that nature. Some are designed to build tension. And same thing, based on the speed, you could induce excitement or depression. And depression is not sadness, but more of a slower process. So the faster the clicks were, the more excited you were. The slower the clicks were, the more depressed you were. Now, so he felt that all feelings could be described using these 3 characteristics, which is a great idea, except it's not well supported today. Ultimately, we believe our experience, our subjective experience, is far more than those 3 elements. So great to stimulate research, similar to Franz Gall did with phrenology, but it's not well supported as an idea today. Now, Wundt also tried to explain what emotions were. So Wundt defined emotions as, compounds of feeling elements, right? So these elements come together to be experienced as an emotion, right? So let's talk about consciousness. He had the doctrine of apperception. Now, the word apperception is more of a perception of perception, right? So the doctrine of apperception is trying to understand how we put consciousness all together. So we're trying to study or look at consciousness or perception on a deeper level. So how are mental elements put together? And Wundt adopted a principle that's very similar to John Stuart Mill, which you need to know for test 1, and many of the Gestalt psychologists, that when we put elements together, mental elements together, it is the sum is greater than the individual parts, or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You might have heard it said. So he believed in creative synthesis. When you add these elements together, it comes into something new. It creates something new or more than just what previously was. And that's a big idea, right? You heard about this, and I talked to you that John Stuart Mill disagreed with his father, James Mill, right? And said, hey, no, we have this creative synthesis. He also suggested, he being Wundt, that the mind is an active process, a constructivist view. So instead of the arguments of people like James Mill and Julian de Latmettrie, who suggest that the mind was passive and machine-like, mechanistic, he rejected that notion. So if we were to look at how he describes the psychical experience, he says every psychical compound shows attributes which may be understood from the attributes of its elements, but which are by no means to be looked upon as the mere sum of the attributes of these elements. The aggregate, the sum, is a new psychical content that was made possible by these elements, but was no mean contained in them. And I love that because it's almost poetic the way he describes this understanding of this novel process or this creative synthesis. So I love that. And the best analogy we have is actually from chemistry. When we put when we look at hydrogen by itself and we look at oxygen by itself, these are separate elements, but when we put them together and we put two hydrogen molecules together with an oxygen molecule, we get water, which is an entirely new experience or state of matter. So it's really remarkable how he describes creative synthesis. All right, so this new content, like I said, was expressed by the principle of creative synthesis, and he suggested that creative synthesis is not contrary to the laws of the natural world, right? So physics. So things like physical measurements dealt with objective mass, force, energy, but psychical measurements dealt with subjective values and ends and how these energies could be put together, right? It's organizing these components in a more subjective way. So that's Wundt in a nutshell. He talks about apperception, which is important. That's one of the key elements. He talks about creative synthesis and how elements get put together in a novel experience emerges. Very fantastic. But so if I'm raving about his work, you might ask, well, why isn't that his work took off? Well, number one, although he was popular in the beginning, it really didn't move the needle on academic psychology in Germany. So he didn't have a significant mark as its own discipline. In fact, it was considered more of a philosophy. And this point of psychology being viewed as a philosophy in Germany and to some degree in the United States, we'll talk about that in applied psychology, that creates a sense that psychology was lesser than, it wasn't as good. So Germany viewed it as a subspecialty of philosophy. Most, if you get a psychology degree on a doctoral level, most doctoral degrees are PhDs, doctorate in philosophy, and it comes back from these origins. Now, his influence was not very profound in Germany, but what we see is that his students really shaped the growth of psychology in the United States. So psychology moves in a different direction in the United States, but it was his students that helped move it in a different direction. So what are some criticisms of Wundtian psychology? Well, some people felt that the concept of introspection really wasn't proper. And it is possible that if you had two people do the same introspective process on a rose, let's say, they might come up with different interpretations, different descriptions, which leaves you with the question, well, if you had two people observe the same thing, who's correct? We also understand that introspection happens within the mind, right? So that's more of a private experience. And introspection could not address the issue of replication studies. So introspection, although it is a good tool, people criticize that as his tool for research. Now, another thing that people say is Wundt shaped the early stages of psychology because he was so prolific, because he wrote so much. As I mentioned earlier in the lesson, he wrote about 2.2 pages, whether it be a journal article or a book per day. We talked about in a 20-year span, he published 180 pieces. So it is very hard to criticize a person that's prolific, because by the time you get published with your response to him, he would already have it addressed within minutes. So very, very problematic. And then other people weren't welcoming to Wundt's psychology because he blamed England for starting World War I, right? So his politics put him on the outside, right? So Germany post-World War I was viewed as the villain. Germany was considered the major country that caused the war, but Wundt said no, it was actually England who caused the war. And even though Germany invaded Belgium, he said it was more of an act of self-defense. And those were not very popular opinions. So his political views also got him into trouble in his day. So after World War I, you start to see two schools of thoughts that really develop and push the limits of Wundt's psychology. So we talked about Gestalt and psychoanalysis. These subdisciplines got a lot more attention and got a lot more traction in the field of psychology, even in Germany. So when you think about volunteerism and Wundt's perspectives, ultimately they get overshadowed, right? And then in the United States, we had William James, right? And the spirit of functionalism. And we had Watson and Skinner, who pushed behaviorism. So these schools of thought overshadow Wundt. So whether it be in Germany or the United States, there are these competing understandings of what psychology should study that ran circles around his views. Now, to me, it's kind of sad, because if you ask me, I think that Wundt did a great deal of work on sensation perception. And when we think about neuroscience and sensation perception studies, Wundt really should be given more credit for other people's developments later. So now, in terms of Wundt's psychology, we start to see that Wundtian psychology starts to fade. So let's paint the picture. After World War I, there's this financial collapse in Germany. Germany is required to pay billions of dollars back due to the war and being suggested to be the instigator or the causing the provocation. So there's a significant amount of money that is required to be paid back to countries like France and England and many other countries. So their economy tanked, and they tried to solve the problem by just printing more money. What's the problem if you print more money? We're experiencing it in the United States today. We get inflation, right? So inflation, you print more money, the value of a dollar is less, which means the prices go up. And Germany got caught up in this, and they got caught up in a cycle of this, which ultimately was referred to as hyperinflation, to the point where their currency was almost worthless. So you had people who had life savings that were boiled down to just pennies because of World War I and the economic state. So that financial experience that's happening in Germany also impacts German institutions. So the German universities that were considered at the most elite of the elite, right, wind up being in financial ruins themselves. And then, of course, with the rise of Nazism in World War II, there was also the development of aircrafts, right? So people started dropping bombs, and indeed, Wundt's laboratory was bombed during World War II. So the sentiment was the nature, context, form, and even the home of Wundtian psychology were lost. And that's sad, right? So when you think about it, the context, he did so much for the creation of the discipline. But when you think about what happens afterwards, it disappears. And Wundt, as much as he's considered the father of psychology, his sub-discipline is gone. There's no such thing as volunteerism, right? And Titchener uses the term structuralism. There's no such thing as structuralism around anymore. So even his model is gone today. So what is his legacy? Well, his legacy still is that he rejected non-scientific thinking. He wanted to create a more objective science. He also separated through experimental psychology its relationship to philosophy. Ironically, we said that psychology was still housed in a philosophy department in universities at that time, but he really separated the two. He created a spirit that resulted in scientific psychology. He also tried to stay a focus on the things that you could measure or quantify. So he used your conscious experience and empirical methods and things like talking about the soul or things of that nature he didn't do much of. He also was a scholar, so the publish or perish mindset that we still have, he adopted, and that's his legacy, that he was well published. He trained the first generation of psychologists. I told you that people came from all around the world to learn under Wundt. Now you're going to see that Sigmund Freud was a little bit like that too. A lot of people went to Vienna to learn under Freud. Even the people who wind up his biggest detractors, former students of his, started as disciples learning under him. So Wundt has that legacy of shaping American psychology. And some people consider him the most important psychologist of all time. I personally don't. I actually think that William James is far more important than Wilhelm Wundt, but nevertheless, I can understand the argument. The argument is that he created the foundations of the science. Now, and of course, his ideas were not beyond reproach. So another one of his legacies is that he inspired rebellions. He inspired people to criticize his work and think about ideas in a very different way. And that's good science, right? So if you can inspire criticism, you're going to inspire further research. So that's his legacy. So we talked about Wundt. Let's talk about other developments that are happening in Germany, right? So it's important to understand that Wundt's monopoly of the discipline really was short-lived when you think about it. There were other individuals in Germany who were formulating their own points of view. And of course, as psychology morphed away from Germany to England and the United States, we start to see other people shape the discipline more. So Darwin's theory of evolution and Galton's concept of individual differences in mental functioning. All of these elements really took psychology in a different way. So what's the take-home message? Psychology becomes very splintered. It becomes very fractured. And Wundt's version was just one of many. So now let's talk about other German scholars, though, right? Because he wasn't the only scholar. Hermann Ebbinghaus, his ideas of learning and memory are, to this day, well supported. And we're talking about a person who is writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with limited resources and technology, but he was able to understand the process of learning, memory, forgetting, and relearning, all of these ideas. So he's one of the first people to study more higher mental processes. And that's important because you may remember that Wundt said, we can't study mental processes. That was outside of the purview, right? Well, he demonstrated that Wundt was incorrect. And he felt that if we understood how learning took place, we could better explain memory. And he felt that associative learning is the way to go. So he started to develop these nonsensical word lists and try and get people to learn to associate them, right? So he did it in real time, and he was able to track how people made associations. He was able to track how quickly you could acquire that information and whether you held on to that information at a later point. So let's talk a little bit about Ebbinghaus. Ebbinghaus, he studied college at the University of Bonn, right? He shifted his focus from history to philosophy and then towards science. Eventually, he read Fechner's Elements of Psychophysics. Again, there's Fechner influencing the field again. And he was quite impressed how Fechner was able to quantify psychophysics. So he's like, I want to do the same. And I want to do the same for higher order mental processes, things like learning and memory. So he tries to develop a system. And he's the first undertaking he did was to move to a completely psychological phenomenon, move away from physiology, just noticeable differences, things like that, and start studying learning and forgetting. Now, he was able to create an equation that allowed him to determine how you were able to develop recall That's your ability to retrieve previously learned information. And he discovered something important: the law of rehearsal or repetition. The more times you reviewed the material, the more you're able to recall the material. And even if you forgot the material, the more times you rehearsed the material, the quicker it was that you could relearn the material. Now, keep in mind, his design was using nonsense syllables, right? So when I say nonsense syllables, he had word lists that were vowel, consonant, vowel, or vice versa, and they weren't real words. So CAX, right? That's not a word, but he would have a list of those, and he was able to determine the process of learning. And again, I can't stress the importance of rehearsal. So the more times you repeat and rehearse the information, the more you remembered. And even though it was nonsense syllables, it was possible for you to forget, and then the relearning curve was the same. So what was interesting about his research, though, was that he used a single subject design, which if you took a research methods class, we know that it's hard to generalize from a case study or a single subject design to a larger audience. And more problematic was that not only did he do a single subject design, he was his own subject. So he was the person memorizing these word lists. And typically, if a researcher is studying something, there is a bias because they know exactly what the hypothesis is. However, all of that being said, he was able to still do meaningful research. And despite being a single subject design, and despite him being the only person who he subjected to this research, his findings were accurate. And you might say, well, how does that work? The fact that they were nonsense syllables meant that it was less subject to experimenter bias. And that's cool, right? So he was able to quantify, and he had a whole bunch of lists. He had 3-letter lists, 4-letter lists, 5-letter lists, and he calculated averages to determine how quickly people learn. And he also, got rid of confounding variables by keeping everything the same, the routine, the time of day when they were learning the memory, and so forth. So he came up with his learning curve, right? He came up with his forgetting curve as a function of this. But you're like, I keep using the word nonsense syllables. Really, they were meaningless series of syllables. It was not designed to be actual words. Is it possible that you strung a few letters together and it made a word, C-A-T, making cat? Sure. But even if you made a word C-A-T, the fact that the other ones were not objective words, you couldn't link them together in a meaningful way. So it usually was consonant, vowel, consonant pairings, and he created 2,300 of these. And what he found was that meaningless syllables was almost 10 times or 9 times harder to learn than actual words. So the more you can make material meaningful and useful to you, the more likely you're going to learn them. And you know how I said it was 3-letter words, 4-letter, 5-letter words? Most intro to psychology textbooks talk about the 3-letter combinations, but it wasn't just limited to 3-letter combinations. And what he found was the longer the word, the more rehearsals or repetitions you needed. So again, here's his methodology. So he controlled the environment, quantified how many times a rehearsal took place, and then was able to determine the amount of time it took to acquire that knowledge. So that was his methodology. He could quantify, well, how many times did I have to go over this? And at a certain point, you could memorize a whole list, right? So he also wanted to study overlearning. So what happens if you continue to repeat this list more than necessary? That's called overlearning. Did it pay any dividends? Right? So the answer is, in the initial recall, the answer is no. In a long-term process, the answer was yes, it did. And I'll explain that in a minute. So he also studied association between lists and the learning curve and so forth. Now, I said you have a test next class, right? So, and I also said that you want to, make the material meaningful and review your notes. So based on the principles that Ebbinghaus set forth, the more times you review your notes, the better off you're going to do on the test. The more times you rehearse your notes, the better. That's the first principle. He also talked about the forgetting curve. Again, he used nonsense syllables, which means that even after you mastered the list, if enough time goes by, you're going to forget the list, right? Because it has no real substance to hold on to it. So there is a rapid drop off, but ultimately it flatlines. And the best example of the forgetting curve that I give is, I want you to think back to high school when you had to learn a foreign language. And you might have learned a foreign language pretty well, and then you stopped using it. So you started to forget what you learned. But did you forget everything? The answer is no. What's going to happen is the knowledge is going to drop down to maybe about 30% and plateau. You don't forget everything. But that's your forgetting curve. It drops precipitously, then flatlines. And that's an important thing, because when it comes to relearning, if I wanted to learn Spanish a second time, because I didn't forget everything, it's going to be easier to learn it again. So that's the relearning curve as well. Rosa Maria. Rosa Maria?
Yeah, I when I was little, I was taught Italian, but it wasn't that I went to school. My family spoke to me, so I picked it up as a child. And then as I grew older, they didn't really speak it around me, so I forgot it. And then when I went to high school and college, I took Italian classes because I wanted to better myself. And I did learn it better. But then when I visited Italy and I spoke it every day for 4 months straight with everyone around me, it just became like English to me, came very easy because I was practicing it every day and I was remembering more and more.
Yeah. And that's a different process at play, but it's a great story. The last process was more of an immersive process. We learn best when we're in an experience or a process where we have to use it. So I would tell you the best way to learn Italian is to work in a restaurant in Italy, because you're going to have to speak to a lot of people, right? And you're going to practice and practice and practice that way, or listening to Italian news channels, because what's nice about that is that they're going to speak at a rhythm that is considered professional for being on air. They are also going to use traditional words versus more modern slang words, right? So that's the immersive process. And that's what you got when you were 4 months in Italy. But what you also got was the learning process and the forgetting process, and then the relearning process. So that's where your story is more relevant, is you learned Italian, stopped using it, forgot it, learned it again. It was easier to learn the next time, right? So let's look at some of these graphs from Ebbinghaus. So if we look at the impact of rehearsal on learning, so let's look at the left graph first. If you reviewed a word list of nonsense syllables, right? 8 times, 16 times, 24 times, all the way to 64 times on day one. So you learn the list, but you did overlearning, right? So at a certain point, you learn the list and you might say, well, that was overkill. Why am I continuing to review it? Because it's nonsense syllables, you might very well forget it by the next day. But based on the amount of rehearsals you did on day one, look at the amount of time it takes to relearn it on day two. So if you only did 8 rehearsals, it takes about 20 minutes to relearn that word list, the same list you saw the previous day. But if you did 32, it drops to about 15 minutes. And if you did 64, it drops to 7 minutes. So my general principle that I recommend students when reviewing for a test is to review your notes a minimum of 4 times. And when I say review your notes, I want you to read it out loud. Read it out loud, word for word. Do not skim with your eyes. Do not skip even one word. You do that rehearsal as if you're learning a song. The more times you go over your notes, the more you're going to remember. So why do I say a minimum of 4 times? Because the first time you're doing it, you're going to stumble over words and concepts, and even my sentence structure sometimes are grammatical errors. So it's going to take you time to sift through some of that. And then you're going to do it a second time. It's going to get a little bit quicker to review. And you're going to start to anticipate what's going to be said. And then a third time, and then a fourth time. By the fourth time, you're going to be flying through it. Even though you're reading over 100 slides of material, you might be able to get through all 100 slides word for word on that 4th rehearsal in less than an hour. So that's remarkable. But what's that going to do? It's going to help you when you take your test. Now, I say a minimum of 4 times because that's where you start to get fluent with the concepts. But that doesn't stop you from doing more than 4. And there's evidence based on Ebbinghaus's research, the more times you repeat something, the more you're going to learn it. And when you're re-exposed to it, the less time it takes to reacquire it. So that's a very good tip. Now, we talked about the forgetting curve. I mentioned that through time, you don't really forget everything. So let's say we learned a whole word list of nonsense syllables. We started with 100% retention. Through time, it's going to drop down and drop down. But notice it doesn't drop entirely to 0. By around 40%, it starts to almost flatline. So you're going to retain about 30 to 40%. And this was nonsense syllables. So when we talk about foreign languages or reviewing notes, it's more, you can make more associations. So you might even remember a little more than 30 to 40%. So how does the forgetting curve relate to the first one? Well, the reason why it's quicker on day 2 is because you didn't forget everything. How does that relate to you in studying? If you start your 4 rehearsals now and you want to make sure you're prepared for the exam next Thursday, my recommendation is do your 4 rehearsals and then review the notes again the night before, because time's going to pass. We have something called interference. So that's going to interfere with your ability to remember everything. But coming back to the notes once again, right before the exam, you're gonna re-access the material, and you only need to look at it maybe one more time. So who knew you're gonna get tips on how to study? And they're tried and true. We have 150 years of research from Ebbinghaus to the present that demonstrates rehearsal is a powerful tool. Now you're like, damn, I wish they would have taught me that freshman year. I'm sorry. But this is pretty cool tool. All right. So what are some of Ebbinghaus's other contributions? So he founded another journal called the Journal of Psychology and Physiology of the Sense Organs, right? So now this journal is in addition to what's happening with Wundt's journal. And this particular journal linked psychology and physiology. So its stated focus was linking psychology with physiology, or linking lecture 3 with lecture 4, if I say it based on what we're doing. Versus Wundt's journal was more about experimental research. So he being Ebbinghaus, argued that psychology and physiology are two inseparable pieces. You cannot separate physiology from psychology. In addition to this class, I'm teaching biological psychology. And the first thing I told my students in that class is everything psychological is biological. Not everything biological is psychological, but the other way is true. And that statement that I make is based on the viewpoint of people like Ebbinghaus, that you cannot separate psychology from physiology. The other advantage is that as more and more research labs start to develop, you have competition for pages. And there are only so many pages in a journal. So now, when Ebbinghaus and Koenig create this Journal of Psychology and Physiology of the Sense Organs, now you have another resource to publish. You don't have to publish in Wundt's journal. He also developed the first sentence completion tasks, which we use as a projective measure, right? A projective test for personality. So the first sentence completion task he did. In 1902, he wrote Principles of Psychology, which he dedicated to Fechner. And then 1908, he wrote a summary of psychology, which is more pop psychology. So Ebbinghaus did understand that there was an appetite outside of academia for psychology. And that exists even to this day. So when you think about magazines like Psychology Today is not a purely psychology science journal. It is designed for people who are either in the discipline or the everyday person to read and learn a little bit more about what psychology has to say about certain things. If you go into your self-help portions of a bookstore, and I know bookstores are becoming like dinosaurs because everything's digital today, but if you go into Barnes and Noble, there's a section on self-help books. Well, that understanding that people outside of academia want to know what's working and how psychology plays a role, you can see it even today. So Ebbinghaus was well ahead of his time. Now, these points that I'm making might make you feel that, hey, Ebbinghaus' contributions were far more influential than Wundt's when you think about it, right? Because while Wundt's version of psychology has faded away and he has no sub-discipline anymore, the research that Ebbinghaus put together has withstood the test of time. And that is powerful. And another thing, Ebbinghaus didn't need students to carry on his message. Wundt had Titchener and many others. Ebbinghaus didn't need that. And yet he still was able to maintain his relevancy to psychology. So these are all arguments as to why Ebbinghaus might be more influential than Wundt. This is a great place to stop because I want to talk to you about Gestalt psychology and that development, but that should be its own sub lecture. So I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to take attendance one more time. And, I'll stick around if anyone has questions for me.